No, not that Goku Shi II. Goku Shi is the Japanese title of the novel known in the West as Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It's a very fictionalized telling of the civil wars in China that occurred around the end of the Han Dynasty. It's hard to know exactly when the book was written, but copies are known to exist dating back to the late 15th century, which put it rather firmly in the public domain, and so anyone could adapt Goku Shi and make their own video game based on it. And that's why we have Koei's series of Goku Shi and Namco's series of Goku Shi. To minimize confusion, the Namco games are typically referred to by their subtitle. Not that Namco didn't draw heavy inspiration from Koei's series. If you only looked at the broad strokes of how the games work, you might think that they were effectively the same. But Namco's games are designed for consoles instead of computers, and as a result are much more streamlined. There's only one scenario here. You pick out which warlord you want to play as, and then conquer China. Every turn is a month, and you can take a number of actions based on the number of cities that you control. Even if you control only one city, you get to take 3 actions. There's the now standard options to improve your province, and you can engage in a bit of diplomacy, but a new option just sends one of your generals out to check out what's happening in the countryside, and they will always find some gold or some rice, the 2 currencies of the game, when they do this. So there's no reason not to send somebody out. You can also try to convince enemy generals to join you. Doing so depends on their loyalty stat, and that has resulted in a particular strategy for the game. Lu Bu, of Not Pursuing fame, is the strongest general in the game, but his loyalty starts out super low. So ideally, on turn 1, you bribe him to join your side, and then pay whatever you can to bring his loyalty up so somebody else can't steal him. For managing your military, you can recruit more troops or search for generals. Every general can have 1,000 soldiers underneath them, and you don't have any control over the composition of the army. The other important thing in town is that you can buy weapons and armor for your officers. This improves their performance in the RPG-style combats that they could get into. When you think you've identified a juicy target, it's time to send your soldiers off to war, and you'll need to bring enough rice with you to make sure that your army stays fed. Battles take place on maps like this, and on every turn you get a certain number of action points for your side. These are shared among all of your units. So you could spend them all having one general move the maximum distance, or you could divide them up as you see fit. Generals also have access to tactics that cost some of those action points, and these do things like pin enemies in place, or attack their rice supplies. My opponent in this battle, for example, couldn't face me on an open field, so instead they attacked the rice over and over again. When 2 armies come together, you can choose to battle. And in battle, you first choose an army formation, and then tactics for the 4 types of units: your general, cavalry, archers, and spearmen. The 4 tactics that they can do are advance, siege, wait, and retreat. And then once you've entered all that, the battle runs itself. You can hit A during the battle to bring up a menu and change your tactics, but that's really the only thing you have control over. The effectiveness of your army will depend on the military skill of your general. So in this case, my high-skilled generals are just making mincemeat out of the opposing forces. There really isn't an easy option to do anything other than an all-out assault. If you just wanted to whittle away on your opponent's forces with what you've got, you'll have to send in certain kinds of troops and then have them retreat. For example, at this castle, it was packed with bowmen, and the only people who could really deal with that were other archers. So I had to order all of my archers to march into the Valley of Death there, and then once they were wiped out, I had to retreat and send in the next army. Eventually I wore them down enough that I broke through. If 2 generals come together, then they engage in a little bit of RPG combat. Here you have to choose what type of attack you're going to perform, and then they just swing at each other. If you take out the general, then the rest of the army goes away. And naturally, if you wipe out all of the armies on the field, then you win the territory. As time passes, some of your generals might die of old age, but there will be new generals who are born and coming up, and they'll become available for you to recruit. One issue with the game is that because of the starting point and the fact that there's only one scenario, Liu Bei, who's the nominal protagonist of the novel, has a very poor starting position. He controls one city wedged in among some very powerful opponents. He is compensated for this, though, by having the second and third most powerful generals in the game on his side. Something you might have noticed, assuming you have a very good memory, is that Sangoku Shi II Haou no Tairiku is extremely similar to the original game. The graphics are improved, you have a few additional options, and your choice of general is no longer determined by a personality quiz, but otherwise Namco stuck with a formula that worked for them. And people seem to respond pretty positively to it. This is regarded as one of the better strategy games on the Famicom. Namco would wind up remaking the game a few years later for Namco Anthology Volume 1 on the PlayStation, a disc made up of several remakes of 8-bit Namco games, though Namco dropped the Sangoku Shi II from the title when they did that. I'm not quite as enamored with this game as its fans are. I don't care for how the combat plays out. I think I'd rather stick to the larger map view rather than have to watch the whole combat play out over time. And it's possible for enemy generals to drag the game out by constantly running away with a small quantity of troops. But overall, this is a pretty good strategy game for the Famicom. It's definitely easier to get into than the other Sangoku Shi games.